There is a version of World War II that most people carry with them. It has clear sides. It has a moral architecture. It has monsters who were recognized as monsters, and heroes who were recognized as heroes, and somewhere beneath all of it, a kind of logic that suggests the right outcome was inevitable. That version is not entirely false, but it is incomplete in ways that matter, and the incompleteness was not accidental. Records were altered, testimonies were suppressed. Institutional decisions that would have complicated the dominant narrative were quietly filed away, reclassified, destroyed, or simply never entered into the official account in the first place. What remains is a war that has been edited, not dramatized for effect, but edited the way a bureaucracy edits, methodically, with paperwork, with authorization signatures, with the calm, procedural language of people who believed they were managing information rather than distorting history. This is not a story about villains operating in shadows. That framing is too simple and too comforting. The more accurate framing is that the war functioned as a system, and systems do not require villains. They require participants. They require forms filled out correctly. They require people who show up on time, follow procedure, and do not ask the kinds of questions that would slow the process down. The most disturbing thing about World War II is not that it contained acts of extraordinary cruelty. It is that those acts were often ordinary, scheduled, budgeted, reported upward through chains of command in language designed to make violence sound like administration. What follows are 18 areas where that administration left marks that officials later tried to erase, alter, or prevent from entering the public record. Not because the events were chaotic, but because they were too orderly, too documented, too revealing of how the machinery actually worked. The first concerns the firebombing of Dresden in February of 1945. The official British and American account, the one that was constructed and maintained through the post-war decades, held that the bombing was a legitimate military operation targeting a significant German transportation and industrial hub. The casualty figures were contested almost immediately, but the contestation itself was managed. Early estimates from German sources suggested deaths in the range of 200,000 or more. Those figures were dismissed as Nazi propaganda, which some of them were. But the process of arriving at the official Allied figure, which eventually settled at around 25,000, involved deliberate suppression of intermediate counts, restriction of access to German civil records from the affected area, and active discouragement of independent investigation for decades. The RAF's own operational logs for the Dresden raids were classified at levels that prevented public access until the 1990s. And even then, significant portions relating to specific targeting decisions and the chain of authorization for the second and third waves of bombing were withheld or redacted. What made Dresden uncomfortable was not just the scale of death, but the timing. The war in Europe was effectively over. Every senior Allied commander knew that German military collapse was a matter of weeks at most. The strategic rationale for destroying a city filled with refugees was, at best, marginal. At worst, the raid served as a demonstration of capability, a message directed not at Germany, which was already finished, but at the Soviet Union, which was watching. That interpretation was never officially acknowledged. The paperwork describing the raids used standard operational language. Transportation interdiction, industrial suppression. The forms were filled out correctly. The second concerns the firebombing of Japanese cities in the months before the atomic attacks. The destruction of Tokyo on the night of March 9th into 10th, 1945, killed somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 people in a single night. The actual figure has never been precisely established because the record-keeping infrastructure of the affected areas was itself destroyed in the attack, and because American military authorities made a deliberate decision not to conduct a rigorous post-strike casualty assessment of the kind that would have been applied to a military installation. General Curtis LeMay's shift from high-altitude precision bombing to low-altitude area incendiary attacks was a strategic decision that effectively redefined the target from military infrastructure to urban civilian population density. The internal Air Force documents describing this shift use language that is almost entirely technical. Optimal incendiary coverage, structural vulnerability of target housing stock, fuel load per square mile. The people living in that housing stock do not appear in the planning documents in any way that would indicate they were the primary variable being calculated. They appear as a function of the landscape. And after the raids, when the casualty figures began to be compiled, the reports moving upward through the command structure were careful to separate the destruction of industrial and transportation infrastructure from the associated civilian losses, which were listed separately in smaller type, under a different administrative heading. The operation was considered highly successful. The forms were filled out correctly. The third concerns Operation Paperclip, the American program to recruit German scientists, engineers, and technical specialists at the end of the war, including individuals who had been directly involved in war crimes. This operation has been partially acknowledged and is now relatively well documented in broad strokes. But the specific process by which individual scientists had their records altered or sanitized before being brought into American government service has been consistently understated. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, which administered the program, was operating under explicit instructions to identify and recruit German technical talent regardless of prior Nazi affiliation or wartime conduct, and was simultaneously operating under public assurances from the State and War Departments that no war criminals would be admitted. The resolution of this contradiction was administrative. Records were reviewed, portions were removed, characterizations were altered. Werner von Braun, who had used slave labor from the Dora concentration camp to manufacture V-2 rockets, had his file described in terms that emphasized his scientific value and minimized or omitted his documented knowledge of conditions at Dora. He was not an anomaly. He was the template. The agency processed over 1,600 scientists through a system that was explicitly designed to produce clean files from dirty histories. The people who operated that system were not acting secretly. They had authorization, they had budgets, they had office space and filing cabinets and regular working hours. The process had a name and an organizational chart. The forms were filled out correctly. The fourth concerns the Soviet massacre at Katyn, where approximately 22,000 Polish military officers, police, intellectuals, and other members of the Polish professional class were killed by the NKVD in the spring of 1940. The massacre itself predates American involvement in the war, but America's relationship to knowledge of it is a wartime record that was deliberately managed. By 1943, when Germany announced the discovery of mass graves in the Katyn forest, American intelligence had already received substantial evidence suggesting Soviet responsibility. The Roosevelt administration made a deliberate decision to suppress that evidence. Owen O'Malley, the British ambassador to the Polish government in exile, wrote a report in 1943 that concluded with near certainty that the Soviets were responsible. That report was classified, and its conclusions were not shared with the public or with the Polish government in exile in any meaningful way. American officials who raised the Katyn question internally were discouraged from pursuing it. The reason was strategic. The alliance with the Soviet Union was considered essential to winning the war, and the truth about Katyn was considered incompatible with maintaining that alliance in the public mind. So the truth was filed. It remained classified in American archives until 1951, when a congressional investigation began to unravel the suppression. And even then, the full extent of American intelligence knowledge about Katyn in 1943 was not publicly acknowledged for decades. The decision to suppress that knowledge was not made by one person in a moment of panic. It was made through a deliberate interagency process, documented in memoranda, discussed in meetings, and implemented through the normal mechanisms of classification and information control. The forms were filled out correctly. The fifth concerns the Allied bombing of concentration camps, or more specifically, the decision not to bomb them. By the summer of 1944, American and British intelligence had aerial photographs of Auschwitz-Birkenau that clearly showed the gas chambers and crematoria, the rail lines leading to them, and the ongoing operation of the killing process. Jewish organizations, the Polish government in exile, and War Refugee Board officials made specific requests to the War Department to bomb the rail lines leading to Auschwitz or to bomb the killing facilities themselves. The War Department rejected those requests through a process that was entirely formal and documented. The stated reason was that such bombing would divert resources from the primary military mission, and that the results would be uncertain and the risks to inmates unacceptable. Those reasons were internally debated and found to be largely pretextual. The 8th Air Force was bombing industrial targets within 50 miles of Auschwitz during the same period. The rail lines in question were not significantly different from other rail lines that were being struck. The decision not to bomb was not a decision born of operational impossibility. It was a decision born of priority assessment. The killing of Jews at Auschwitz was not assigned sufficient strategic weight to justify the operational cost. That assessment was made, documented, approved, and filed. The people who made it went home at the end of their working days. They were performing their jobs. The forms were filled out correctly. The 6th concerns the treatment of German prisoners of war by American forces in the immediate aftermath of the war in Europe. Dwight Eisenhower created a new classification for German POWs in April 1945, designating them as disarmed enemy forces rather than prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. This classification change had a specific and significant consequence. Deaths, as they were designated in American military documentation, were not entitled to the same food rations, shelter, and medical care required under the Geneva Convention for POWs. The practical result was that hundreds of thousands of German soldiers held in open-air enclosures along the Rhine River, in conditions that would have been considered violations of international law if applied to recognized POWs, died of starvation, exposure, disease, and medical neglect during the spring and summer of 1945. The precise death toll has been disputed by historians and ranges from a few thousand to several 100,000, depending on the methodology and sources used. What is less disputed is that the classification change was deliberate, that it was designed specifically to create a legal framework that removed Geneva Convention obligations, and that internal military communications from the period show awareness of the mortality rates in the enclosures without triggering corrective action. The Red Cross was denied access on the grounds that DEFs were not POWs and therefore not subject to Red Cross monitoring. The documentation of this period was aggressively managed. Camp records from several Rhine enclosures were reported as lost or incomplete. The mortality statistics that did survive were filed in ways that made aggregate analysis difficult. It was not chaos. The classification system worked exactly as intended. The forms were filled out correctly. The 7th concerns British imperial conduct in the Bengal famine of 1943, which overlaps with the war in ways that are usually separated, but are in reality inseparable. The famine killed between 2 and 3 million people in Bengal, which was then a part of British India and therefore a part of the Allied war effort. The famine's causes included crop failures, wartime disruption, and inflation, but they also included deliberate British policy decisions. The denial policy, which was designed to prevent rice and boats from falling into the hands of a potential Japanese invasion force, systematically removed food production assets and transportation infrastructure from the most vulnerable areas of Bengal. Exports of rice from India continued even as the famine developed. Winston Churchill's war cabinet was informed of the mortality and made decisions about food allocation that prioritized other theaters and strategic stockpiling over famine relief. Churchill's personal comments on the Bengal famine, recorded in cabinet minutes and private communications, are direct in their indifference. The Indian population's survival was not a primary variable in the war cabinet's calculations. After the war, the administrative records relating to specific food allocation decisions and denial policy implementation were selectively preserved, with portions that most directly implicated cabinet-level decision-making classified or transferred to files that were not opened for public review until the 1990s and 2000s. The famine was categorized as a wartime tragedy. The policy decisions that shaped it were categorized as administrative responses to wartime conditions. The forms were filled out correctly. The eighth concerns the use of chemical weapons by British forces in Mesopotamia and the broader trajectory of British chemical weapons development and deployment policy through the Second World War. Britain entered the war with substantial chemical weapon stockpiles and an active production program. Churchill advocated on multiple occasions for the use of chemical weapons, particularly in the event of a German invasion, and later as a potential tool against Germany itself. A memorandum he wrote in July 1944 called for serious thought about drenching German cities with poison gas, describing it as a question of fashion and squeamishness rather than ethics. The chiefs of staff resisted, and the proposal was not implemented. But the internal deliberations about chemical weapons use against civilian populations were classified at levels that prevented public awareness for decades. Separately, British forces in various colonial theatres made use of chemical agents in ways that were not disclosed in public accounts of those operations. The production and stockpiling records for British chemical weapons during the war were maintained under classification categories that remained in effect long after any plausible national security justification had expired. The post-war accounting of British chemical weapons programs was partial and carefully managed, with the destruction of stockpiles in the late 1940s and 1950s occurring without public disclosure of the scale or composition of what was being destroyed. Large quantities were dumped into the North Sea under a process that was formally documented internally but not reported publicly. The forms were filled out correctly. The ninth concerns the medical experiments conducted not only by Japanese Unit 731 and Nazi physicians, but by American military and intelligence researchers who accessed the results of those experiments through arrangements that were deliberately obscured. The deal struck between American occupation authorities and the leadership of Unit 731, which had conducted lethal biological and chemical weapons experiments on prisoners in Manchuria, is partially known. Shiro Ishii and his senior staff were granted immunity from war crimes prosecution in exchange for providing their experimental data to American biological weapons researchers. What is less publicly known is the internal process by which that arrangement was authorized, documented, and then sealed from public view. The decision to grant immunity to Unit 731 personnel was made at levels that included the office of General Douglas MacArthur, and was routed through the intelligence channels of the Occupation Authority in a way that deliberately bypassed the war crimes prosecution apparatus operating at the time. The American researchers who received and processed the Unit 731 data wrote internal reports that described the experimental methodology, acknowledged its nature, and proceeded to extract the applicable findings for American research programs. Those reports were classified. The immunity arrangement was classified. The specific individuals covered by the immunity arrangement were not disclosed. When the Tokyo war crimes trials concluded without prosecution of Unit 731 personnel, the absence was officially attributed to insufficient evidence, which was precisely the opposite of the truth. The evidence was extensive. It was held by the people who had agreed not to use it. The forms were filled out correctly. The 10th concerns the treatment of Black American servicemen by the United States military, not as a social history question, but as a question of official record-keeping and institutional concealment. The segregated military of the Second World War operated under a documentary regime that systematically underrepresented the combat contributions of black units and overrepresented disciplinary incidents. The court-martial rates for black servicemen were recorded in ways that did not account for the discriminatory application of military justice, and those records were used in post-war analyses to support arguments about military aptitude and suitability for integration that were built on data the military itself had corrupted. The The Distinguished Service Cross and Medal of Honor records from the war show a pattern that was later confirmed by the Army's own 1993 Shore study. Black servicemen who met the criteria for the highest decorations were systematically awarded lesser decorations or no decorations at all, and the recommendation files that would have documented this disparity were in many cases incomplete, missing, or filed in ways that made systematic review difficult. The Army's internal investigation of this issue, conducted in the late 1980s and resulting in the 1993 study, found that the record-keeping itself had been managed in ways that made full reconstruction of the historical record impossible. Not because records were chaotically maintained, but because the gaps were consistent. Consistent gaps are not accidents. They are policy implemented through the accumulation of individual decisions made by people filling out forms in ways that reflected the institutional priorities of a segregated military. The forms were filled out correctly to produce the outcome the institution required. The 11th concerns the mass rape of German and Japanese women by Allied forces, a subject that has been acknowledged in recent scholarship but remains largely absent from the official military record of the war's end. The scale of sexual violence committed by Soviet forces against German civilians as they advanced into Germany in 1944 and 1945 has been more thoroughly documented and is now reasonably well known, with estimates ranging from hundreds of thousands to 2 million victims. Less discussed is the sexual violence committed by American and French forces in Germany and Italy, and by American forces in the Pacific Theater and Japan during the occupation. Military police records from the American occupation of Germany document rape cases in numbers that military historians have described as significant underestimates of actual incidents, because reporting was discouraged, victims were stigmatized, and prosecutions were selective in ways that correlated with the race of the accused. A black American soldier was significantly more likely to be court-martialed and executed for a rape conviction than a white American soldier accused of the same offense in the same theater. The Army's own internal reports from the occupation period acknowledged the discipline problem in language that described it as a morale and order issue rather than a criminal justice issue. The record-keeping of sexual violence incidents was decentralized in ways that made aggregate assessment impossible, and in several documented cases, unit commanders explicitly instructed subordinates not to forward incident reports upward through the chain of command. The result is an official record that contains the problem in fragmentary form while obscuring its scale. The forms were not filled out. That, too, was a choice. The 12th concerns the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, not in terms of whether they occurred or what they destroyed, but in terms of what the official American record suppressed about what happened to the survivors and what was known before the bombs were dropped. The Strategic Bombing Survey, which was tasked after the war with assessing the effects of the atomic attacks, produced findings that were edited before publication in ways that affected 2 specific areas. The survey's medical findings regarding radiation sickness were revised to minimize the long-term effects of radiation exposure, in part because the American government was simultaneously managing public perception of nuclear weapons development and did not want the full scale of radiation mortality to be publicly understood. The censorship of Japanese reporting on atomic bomb casualties during the occupation was systematic and comprehensive. General MacArthur's Occupation Authority imposed strict censorship on Japanese media coverage of Hiroshima and Nagasaki beginning in September 1945 and maintained it until the occupation ended in 1952. Japanese journalists, doctors, and survivors who attempted to report or document the medical effects of radiation exposure were restricted, and their materials were confiscated. American journalists who attempted to file stories about radiation sickness in the months after the bombings found their copy delayed, reviewed, and in some cases killed by military censors. The official position was that reports of radiation sickness were Japanese propaganda. That position was maintained in official communications even after the Army's own medical personnel in Hiroshima had filed reports confirming the radiation effects. The medical reports were classified. The censorship orders were filed in the normal operational record. The forms were filled out correctly. The 13th concerns the fate of the Ustasha regime in Croatia, which operated as a German and Italian client state throughout the war and conducted genocidal killings of Serbs, Jews, and Roma that were documented by German and Italian military officers in reports that described the brutality as excessive by the standards of German occupation authorities. The Ustasha's post-war escape from justice was facilitated by a combination of factors that included the Vatican's involvement through the Rat-line networks, American intelligence recruitment of Ustasha personnel for anti-communist operations, and British strategic decisions about the post-war order in Yugoslavia that made full accountability for Ustasha crimes inconvenient. The specific documentation of how American intelligence agencies recruited former Ustasha officials and operatives in the late 1940s and 1950s was classified and did not begin to be declassified until the 1990s under the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act. What those documents reveal is a systematic process of evaluating former war criminals for intelligence value and constructing or reconstructing their files to support entry into American programs or immigration to the United States. The atrocities committed at camps like Jasenovac, where the Ustasha killed between 70,000 and 100,000 people through methods that German SS officers described in their own reports as unnecessarily cruel, were known to American intelligence from captured German documents. That knowledge did not prevent the recruitment of Ustasha personnel. It was filed alongside the recruitment paperwork. The forms were filled out correctly. The 14th concerns the bombing of Monte Cassino and the broader pattern of Allied destruction of cultural and civilian sites in Italy, and the subsequent management of the record to support a narrative of military necessity that was more complicated in practice than in official description. The destruction of the monastery at Monte Cassino in February 1944 was justified on the grounds that it was being used as a German military observation post. Subsequent investigation, including post-war testimony from German commanders, suggested that the Germans had specifically avoided using the monastery itself as a military position before the bombing, in part to avoid exactly the political and propaganda consequences that the destruction produced. The internal Allied communications debating the bombing decision included dissenting assessments from senior officers who believed the military necessity argument was weak. Those dissenting assessments were not included in the public justifications for the bombing that were released at the time. The destruction of the monastery and significant portions of the surrounding town of Cassino was followed by a prolonged battle that produced massive casualties and ultimately required circumventing the Cassino position rather than directly reducing it, which raised further questions about the military calculus of the bombing that were not pursued in official post-war assessments. The record of Allied targeting decisions in Italy more broadly shows a pattern in which cultural sites, hospitals, and civilian infrastructure were struck, and the post-strike justifications were constructed from the operational record in ways that categorized every strike as a response to confirmed or suspected military use. The documentation was produced. It was filed. It supported the conclusions it was designed to support. The forms were filled out correctly. The 15th concerns the British policy of strategic deception as practiced through the double-cross system and the specific human costs of that system that were never officially acknowledged. The double-cross system, by which British intelligence turned German agents who fed false information to German intelligence throughout the war, is now reasonably well documented and is generally presented as a brilliant intelligence achievement. What is less discussed is the operational requirement of the system, which was that German agents who were not successfully turned had to be identified and eliminated before they could contaminate the false information stream. The execution of German agents in Britain during the war was a matter of official policy implemented through a judicial process, the Special War Measures Act, that was specifically constructed to allow rapid execution with minimal procedural delay. 14 German agents were executed in Britain during the war under this process. The records of those proceedings were classified and remained so for decades. More significantly, the double-cross system required, on multiple occasions, the sacrifice of information that could have saved lives in order to protect the integrity of deception operations. The clearest example involves the German attacks on Coventry in November 1940, around which a persistent historical claim has existed that Churchill knew of the attack in advance through ultra-intelligence and chose not to act on that knowledge in order to protect the ultra-secret. The historical consensus on this specific claim is contested. What is not contested is that decisions were made throughout the war to allow attacks to proceed, rather than take defensive actions that would reveal the extent of Allied signals intelligence. People died as a result of those decisions. The decisions were made through formal processes, reviewed by senior officials, and documented in ways that were classified at the highest levels. The forms were filled out correctly and then locked away for 30 years. The 16th concerns the Malmedy massacre and the subsequent American military tribunal process that tried members of the 1st SS Panzer Division for the killing of American POWs at Malmedy in December 1944. 73 American prisoners of war were shot by SS troops in a field near the Belgian town of Malmedy during the Battle of the Bulge. The event is well documented and is one of the most clearly established German war crimes involving American victims. Less well documented in the popular record is what happened during the American military tribunal process at Dachau in 1946. Evidence subsequently collected and reviewed by a Senate subcommittee in 1949 indicated that American interrogators had used methods during the pre-trial interrogation of SS suspects that included mock trials, mock executions, and physical abuse to obtain confessions. The Judge Advocate's Office had received internal complaints about the interrogation methods during the tribunal process, and those complaints had been routed through a review process that ultimately concluded that the methods were acceptable given the circumstances. Several of the resulting convictions were subsequently reduced or overturned on appeal, in part because of concerns about the confession evidence. The Senate subcommittee investigation into the Malmedy tribunal process was itself politically charged, became entangled with Senator Joseph McCarthy's early career, and produced a record that was compromised by its own procedural irregularities. The specific internal communications from the Judge Advocate's Office regarding the interrogation complaints were not declassified for decades. The trial produced convictions. The process that produced the convictions was documented, reviewed internally, and approved. The forms were filled out correctly. The 17th concerns the fate of Soviet citizens and prisoners of war who were repatriated from German captivity and Western Allied custody to the Soviet Union at the end of the war, a process known in its most coerced form as Operation Keelhaul. The Yalta Agreement included provisions requiring the return of Soviet nationals found in Allied custody in Western Europe. In practice, this meant the forced repatriation of people who had fled Soviet territory, had been captured while serving in German auxiliary units, or had been taken as laborers, many of whom did not want to return and had every reason to fear what would happen to them when they did. American and British forces carried out forced repatriations using physical compulsion in cases where the individuals resisted, turning people over to Soviet custody at collection points where NKVD units were waiting to receive them. The people repatriated in this way faced outcomes ranging from immediate execution to labor camp sentences to ongoing surveillance and social exclusion. The death toll among those repatriated is estimated to range from tens of thousands to several hundred thousands, depending on how the subsequent Soviet treatment is counted. The American and British military records of the forced repatriation operations were handled with particular care. Reports describing the use of physical force to load resistors onto transport vehicles, the suicides of individuals who killed themselves rather than be returned, and the visible distress of children being separated from non-Soviet adults who had been caring for them were filed in operational records that were classified and not subject to public review for decades. The policy had been authorized at the highest levels of both governments. The implementation was documented in field reports. The forms were filled out correctly. The 18th concerns something less dramatic than mass killing and more fundamental to how the war's legacy was constructed. It concerns the deliberate process by which the post-war international order, including the tribunal processes at Nuremberg and Tokyo, was designed and implemented in ways that protected Allied conduct from the scrutiny applied to Axis conduct. This is not a fringe argument. It is one that was made by the defense at Nuremberg itself, and that has been a subject of serious historical and legal scholarship since the tribunals concluded. The Nuremberg tribunals were constructed around crimes that, by design, could only have been committed by the losing side. The crime of aggressive war, as defined and applied at Nuremberg, was not applied to the Soviet Union's invasion of Finland in 1939, its invasion of Poland, or its occupation of the Baltic states. It was not applied to the Allied area bombing campaigns. It was not applied to the atomic bombings. This selective application was not a flaw in the legal framework. It was a feature of it. The legal instruments that defined the tribunal's jurisdiction were drafted by Allied legal teams and explicitly excluded Allied conduct from the categories of prosecutable acts. This was documented. The drafting history of the London Charter, which established the Nuremberg Tribunal, shows the specific legal choices made to ensure that the tribunal's jurisdiction was defined in ways that would not create precedent applicable to Allied actions. Those drafting records were available to scholars who chose to look for them, but they were not publicized. The tribunals were presented publicly as the establishment of universal international law. The drafting records, which told a different story, were filed in archives where they would not complicate that presentation. The forms were filled out correctly by lawyers who knew exactly what they were doing and why. The war ended in August 1945 with unconditional surrenders that transferred the administrative apparatus of the defeated nations into Allied hands. The occupation authorities inherited the filing systems, the records offices, the bureaucratic infrastructure of the states they had defeated. They added to those systems their own documentation of the occupation, the tribunals, the reconstruction programs, and the intelligence operations that followed the formal conclusion of hostilities. The institutions that had enabled the war did not dissolve when the war ended. They were reorganized, renamed, redirected, and in some cases exported. The officers who had administered the logistics of mass killing were evaluated for administrative competence and in numerous cases found to possess skills that were applicable to peacetime and Cold War functions. The legal frameworks that had been constructed to manage the relationship between violence and authorization during the war were extended and refined to manage the same relationship during what followed. The world that existed after 1945 was not a world that had resolved the systems that made the war possible. It was a world that had inherited those systems, filed them under new names, and continued operating them with the same attention to correct procedure that had characterized their wartime application. The paperwork changed. The process did not. The governments that had fought the war established official histories. They funded archives and appointed historians and created the institutional infrastructure for a canonical account of what had happened and why. That infrastructure produced enormous amounts of genuine historical scholarship. It also produced, through the mechanisms of classification, selective declassification, restriction of access, and the simple passage of time that allowed documents to survive or be destroyed according to institutional rather than historical priorities. A record that reflects the interests of the institutions that created it. The most important facts about the war are not the ones that were suppressed. The most important fact is that the suppression was systematic, authorized, and documented, and that the documentation of the suppression is itself held in the same archives as the history it was designed to manage.